So TNA made a big time announcement yesterday, and that is in October. Bound for Glory is going to come to us from Tokyo, Japan. This was kind of out of left field. I'll admit, I did not see this coming, and most people probably did not see this coming. Now that I've had a day to kind of think about this, I'm kind of torn because on the one hand, I could see some good things and some real potential positives for the company as a result of this, but I also see some things that concern me and trouble me a little bit about TNA's decision to have the pay-per-view in Tokyo, Japan. Now, from the positive side, the good side, this to me is an example of TNA trying to establish their own identity. What I talk about so often with this company, being counterculture to the WWE. Well, whereas the WWE does all their pay-per-views either domestically in the United States or in Canada, and that's about the extent of their international pay-per-views, TNA is branching out and expanding and going where the WWE doesn't with a pay-per-view and doing what the WWE doesn't with the pay-per-view. Again, being counterculture, maybe in a way establishing their own identity. To me, that is a definite positive. This allows them to attempt at least to continue to grow their company on an international basis at a time where their business isn't so great on the domestic side. And again, that's something that could potentially be good. Whereas if the domestic business isn't all of that great, but you've got a great following in the UK, you've got a great following maybe in Europe all around, and you branch out into Asia and you get a nice foothold in Japan, you're improving the company's overall bottom line and exposure and likelihood of being sustainable long term by doing that. I also think this is a good job by TNA of capitalizing on their working relationship with Great Muta and Wrestle One, excuse me. I think this is something, that is good to see, this type of collaboration, this type of cooperation and partnership, and seeing TNA actually doing something with it. Now there is a logic and a reason for them having a Wrestle One person like a Sonata be their X Division champion on their television. This was all building up to your biggest show of the year being in Japan. And I would also have to venture a guess that TNA is going to draw a nice, sizable crowd because the Japanese people love professional wrestling, have a deep admiration and respect for the art form of professional wrestling. And I'd be stunned, frankly, if TNA didn't draw a nice big crowd to their biggest show of the year, which will make the show feel better in a way for all the performers. It will make the show feel better for all the people watching via pay-per-views and or streaming services. So these are some good things, but I do have some concerns. I've always thought the Japanese fans were relatively quiet when it comes to professional wrestling. And those of you that watch like New Japan or Noah or whatever, you could chime in and maybe let me know if that's an old stereotype or if that's something that still holds true to this day. I don't watch a lot of Japanese wrestling, never really have, but one thing I always thought was that the Japanese fans had a tendency, other than the occasional like ooh or ah or a little rumble in the crowd, they tended to stay quiet throughout the entire show. And that concerns me. If you're having your biggest show of the year in Japan and a lot of your, let's say, domestic audience doesn't understand the traditions of the Japanese people when it comes to the way they watch professional wrestling, they hear a quiet crowd for the entire show, and that might potentially suck a lot of energy and life force out of the show on pay-per-view to your television audience. I also have a lot of concerns with the tape delay. While I applaud TNA for going international, and I applaud TNA for doing something like this, I have some concerns about them doing a pay-per-view that could potentially be on tape delay. There's like a 13-hour time difference between the East Coast here in the United States and Tokyo, Japan. If you sit there and say that, if you wanted to air the show live here at, let's say, 5 o'clock, would you say like 5 o'clock Eastern time? I mean, you think about this, like 5 p.m. Eastern, you would have to run that show overseas at 6 a.m. Eastern. It doesn't seem to mesh. It doesn't necessarily seem to really work, which would lead me to believe that they will do this pay-per-view on tape delay. And with all of their TV tapings that they already do that are tapings that you get the result weeks ahead of time, I can't imagine that helps your ratings all that much. why would you sit there and potentially put yourself in a situation where you have this huge tape delay with your biggest show of the year to the point where the spoilers are going to get out, the results are going to get out, and a lot of people might not actually tune in to watch your show. They might not at the last minute decide to order the show if they already know what happens and they say, hey, I don't need the perspective. I don't need the full context. I saw what happened. It doesn't look like I like what happened, so I'm not going to watch it. Again, that's a very big concern of mine. I also question, too, with Japan. I understand the whole Wrestle One relationship with the Great Muta and what have you, but why not do an international pay-per-view in the UK? If you were going to do this, then why not do Slammiversary in the UK? And why not spend the last 2 or 3 weeks before Slammiversary doing live shows, live impacts on every Thursday, building up to that pay-per-view? So that way you have several shows with loud, vocal, big, sizable, big league feeling crowds heading into one of your biggest shows of the year. And I would think that with the UK being a very sizable audience for TNA, that maybe that should have been and maybe would have been, you would have thought at least, more of a priority to do a pay-per-view there as opposed to Japan with Bound for Glory. And my other concern is, too, is that I'm kind of the opinion at this point in time that maybe TNA needs to go away from pay-per-views entirely, because it seems like everything they do as a company is always geared towards the impacts. It's geared towards the TV show. It is geared towards the ratings. And the pay-per-views seem to be nothing more than advancement in plot devices for the TV show. As a result, I have a lot of concerns with this being the biggest show of the year. Is TNA actually going to build up to this and actually sit there and make this feel like a truly special, potentially company-changing moment? Or are they going to sit there and undercut Bound for Glory with booking decisions before and after Bound for Glory? So a lot of questions for me. There's some potential good, there's some potential bad, and I could see people's perspectives on both sides from this. And I'm kind of, like I said, on the fence with this. I'm not all that certain it's a bad idea, but I'm also not all that certain that it's a very good idea either. I want to hear from you. What do you think of TNA's decision to have Bound for Glory 2014, arguably their biggest show of the year, in Tokyo, Japan? Do you think this is a good thing that could mean some positive changes for TNA as it starts to head towards 2015? Is this a bad thing where you have a tape delay pay-per-view and the spoilers are going to get out ahead of time? Is this a bad thing in terms of if that Japanese audience is quiet for the majority of the show? Will that suck the life force out of the show? Will the workers, the people actually wrestling, have trouble adapting to that, even though some of the talents there, which is another good thing, have some face recognition there in Japan? The Dudley boys and freaking Matt MVP, obviously the American Wolves. You have some guys of note on your roster that'll probably be booked on your show that are actually somewhat familiar to that Japanese crowd. But again, I want to know from you. Do you think this is a good thing? Do you think this is a bad thing for TNA? Are you kind of on the fence on this and not really sure like I am? Let me know down below.